Hi, friends. Welcome to the room and welcome to Cultivate Your Mental Health. My name is Joyce Ozeh, and I am a civil rights attorney here in Chicago. I'm also a mental health advocate with lived experience, namely with anxiety and depression. And I'm here to help you cultivate your mental health in the way that I was able to do for myself. In this space, we go from a place of mental illness to a place of mental wellness. And more importantly, from a place of mental wellness to a place of mental abundance. I believe that we were designed to live life in the overflow. That means when you get well, you want to be so well that it spills over to your community and your loved ones, because our wellness is tied and connected to those around us. So let's figure out how to get there and how to navigate. Remember, wellness isn't just for you, it's for those you love, it's for your community. So, what I love to do is give you a quick rundown of what we're going to be discussing and walking through in this space today. We are talking about intergenerational trauma and its health effects, mental health effects, the whole nine yards. I'm also going to do audience check-ins, so please say hi to me. Say hi to the space. Let us know where you're watching from. Also, I'll let you know what's coming up next at our next show, and I'll give you some practical pushes so it's not just discussion. You can figure out how to cultivate mental wellness in your own space on your own terms. Does that sound good? Before we go into it, I actually have an announcement that I am very excited about. I'm going to repeat it a couple times throughout the show, but as we've often talked about, for those of you who aren't so new to this space was meant for all of us. It wasn't just meant for me to be talking at you. Rather, my favorite thing is to be talking with you, going on this journey with you. I want it to be interactive. I want you to answer questions. I want you to share your stories. And asking questions and sharing our stories, there's so much healing. There is so much connection. There is so much breaking down of stereotypes and fears and lies that are going to lead to our mental wellness. So now there's a way to ask your questions about mental health and to share your stories. Our team has created an actual email account, and it is called Come Thrive 24/7 at gmail.com. Again, that is Come Thrive 24/7 or 247 at gmail.com. We want you to thrive every day, all day. And we want you to ask your mental health questions, share your stories. If you send questions to that email, I will respond. And our vision for this is that we can have episodes that are just listener focused. That means you can share your story anonymously, or you can include your name, but you can have an entire episode dedicated to your questions and your stories. Come Thrive 247 at gmail.com. Let's have an interaction. Let's discuss. I am very excited about that. I see the check-ins rolling in. Gerard, good evening. So good to see you. Mary Jo, it's so good to see you again. I hope y'all enter the space and ask questions at our new email account. Suraj from Nigeria, I'm so happy you're here. I am also Nigerian American. I was born in the States, but my parents are immigrants, so Nigeria is very near and dear to my heart. I love how big and broad Blackness is, that we can have these conversations across continents and all talk about the same things because we all navigate life similarly, even in different spaces. But okay, those are all the announcements I have for you today. Now we're going to go into the meat and potato of our discussion. But as you know, before we get into our discussion, I like to set the room. So we're going to slow it down. We're going to set the room. Why are we here? Again, this is a space for you. It's a space for you to feel safe as you explore mental wellness, as you explore a lot of the lies and the fears surrounding mental illness, and as you explore your God-given path for healing and freedom and understanding yourself and those you love and those around you. This is our conversation. Feel free to share as you wish, ask questions as you wish. I am not a mental health care or mental health professional. I am a mental health care advocate, and I have a lot of lived experience, and I do a lot of research so that I can connect with you especially. Thank you so much for being here. So let's get into it. The last time, as some of you may know, we discussed trauma from generation to generation and how in some families, and you may have experienced this, in some families, there are codes that are related to mental illness. So when I was diagnosed with anxiety in law school, my mom was like, don't call it anxiety. Why don't you call it stress instead? Why don't you call it fatigue? And I realized that she was trying to code the diagnosis in a way that carried less stigma and in a way that would, what she thought, protect me. We've talked about how important it is to name what we're experiencing so that we can face it head on. But this is really common in the Black community. We code things so that they're not as stigmatized or scary, which is understandable because Black people, especially in the United States, have faced a lot of oppression, a lot of disenfranchisement, and an additional stigma on top of their gender and their Blackness is not something that some Black people feel like they can afford. So I understand the need or the desire to code mental illness from generation to generation. But here's the problem with that. It leads to underestimating the effects and the impact that mental illness has on people and communities. When you're coding something, when you're not calling something what it actually is, you can't heal from it. You can't face it. And it leads to mental illness going undetected, undiagnosed, and untreated with these code words. So what happens is mental illness continues between cycles, generation to generation, because we're not addressing it as it should be. But now we are addressing intergenerational trauma and mental illness, how it shows up in our bodies, and what we can do to change the narrative. So here's the big question that people have asked, and honestly, they're still asking. Is trauma actually passed down between generations? Can trauma affect your offspring, for example? Can you really pass on trauma? Before we discuss things, I always like to define the term so that we know that we're working with the same language. So let's define it. Intergenerational trauma is the theory that trauma can be inherited because there are genetic changes in a person's DNA. So intergenerational trauma is the theory that trauma can be inherited. Trauma includes things like child abuse, family violence, famine, genocide, war. Slavery is a huge one for Black Americans and Black people, even in the African diaspora, and many other things. Trauma can encompass a myriad of things. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about intergenerational trauma. Now, again, I am not a medical healthcare professional. I am a girl who's really interested in science, and the attorney in me is really interested in research. So I'm going to share with you some of my findings. The changes from trauma, according to studies, actually do not change the gene in your body, which is called a genetic change. Instead, they alter how the gene functions, which is called epigenetic changes. So the change does not change the gene, it changes how your genes function. In more basic terms, trauma can leave a chemical mark on a person's genes, which can then be passed down to future generations. This mark doesn't cause a genetic mutation, but it does alter the mechanism by which the genes in your bodies express themselves. As you know, you get 50% of your genes from your mother and 50% of from your genes from your father. And what trauma can do is change how those genes express themselves in you, in your parents' offsprings. This alteration is not genetic, rather, it's called epigenetic. Let's go even deeper into science. Are you following me? Let's dig a little bit deeper. What is epigenetics? Epigenetics is the study of the effects that environment and behavior have on your genes. In essence, epigenetics controls how or why your genes are expressed. I love to learn by example, so I'm going to give you some research examples that have already happened. Research on epigenetics actually show that changes in the regulation of your epigenetics can bring about changes in what is called the human epigenome. Stay with me. Those genomes or epigenomes have been associated with diseases like cancer, type 2 diabetes, among others. I mean, we've seen family members where there's a pattern in practice or a history of cancer. We've seen family members where there's a history of diabetes. This could theoretically be linked to epigenetics or changes in how certain genes are expressed. There are also cognitive behavioral problems associated with epigenetic alterations. And those cognitive behavioral problems can be things like depression. We've seen families where addiction is prominent in their family line, aggression, antisocial behavior, and other mental disorders. All of these theoretically can be linked to the changes in a human epigenome and how trauma from one family or one set of parents can be passed on to their offspring because their epigenome is changing how the genes are expressed. And what results in the change of how those genes are expressed could be linked to diseases, especially mental illness. Now, there have also been related studies that have multiple studies that have observed how experiencing a famine before you're born can affect someone's offspring. Researchers have consistently found that there is a correlation or a link between prenatal exposure to famine and, for example, adult BMI, which is like your body fat percentage, or prenatal exposure to famine and diabetes, or even schizophrenia. What I mean by prenatal is exposure to famine before you're even born. So let's say that my mom experienced a famine when she was a child growing up in Nigeria. That could, under the theory of epigenetics, affect why I tend to be slim, or why me as her daughter may have other forms of illness or forms of how my genes express themselves as her offspring, even though I was not even a consideration or alive when she was going through that famine. Isn't that fascinating? I do want to say that the field of epigenetics, or the way genes express themselves based and impacted by trauma, is still very young. More research is needed, and it is important because epigenetics are reversible. Let me say that again. If you or someone in your family has experienced trauma and you come into the world, you are not tied to the way that trauma expresses itself in your life. You are not tied to the trauma and the emotional after effects of slavery. You are not tied to the trauma and the emotional after effects of poverty, of child abuse in your family, of genocide, of war. It is reversible. And this is the crux of our conversation, and why all of those big words and that context in science is so, so important. Why does understanding intergenerational trauma matter? Let's talk about a few things. First, it gives us insight into what those before us have faced and why they may have cultivated the environment that you and I grew up in. What do I mean by this? Why do we care about what kind of trauma our grandparents, our parents have faced? It gives you grace. Sometimes when I think about how I was raised, I laugh. For example, I do not come from a touchy, feely, huggy, loving family. I come from a loving family, but we don't really hug each other, at least growing up. Growing up, I think I saw my parents kiss each other one time, and it was when my dad was going on a business trip, and it actually disgusted me because I did not grow up in an environment where physical touch or that kind of intimacy was cultivated between my parents. And it wasn't until I got to law school and I saw parents like hugging their children goodbye as they drop them off, or like crying and being very affectionate. And I sat back and thought, maybe I'm the weirdo. Maybe I'm the one who grew up abnormally. Now, this is not to say that we judge our environments or we judge how we were raised, but it is to say this is the importance of understanding what your parents have been through and what their parents went through, because it gives you context into why you grew up in the environment that you grew up in. Why does that matter? Because we need to sometimes forgive, or be patient with those who raised us, because we have no idea what they experienced in order to just survive. I always talk about how having the show, seeing a therapist for years, and even getting diagnosed when I was younger, I'm in my 20s, with depression and anxiety is a luxury. My parents were immigrants. They came here at 17 years old. Do you think that they had time to sit back and contemplate their mental health? They were facing racism. They were facing financial insecurity. They were facing job insecurity. They were facing so many things that the contemplation of their mental health and mental illness was not possible. But then they gave birth to me, and they laid a foundation for me to have these contemplations. So when I look back and think, oh, they weren't that affectionate, and now I'm learning to say I love you. I was the first person in my immediate family with my siblings to be like, I love you. And for the longest time, my mom couldn't bring herself to say it back. She would just be like, mm-hmm, uh-huh. And I would literally have to say, Mommy, say I love you back. Now she texts it to me all the time, and it's the most beautiful thing. But I remember when I had to introduce it to her, and all I could think now is, I wonder what she went through where even I love you feels foreign. And I'm not mad at her for having to grow in that space, because one, she's grown beautifully and I love her and she expresses it to me now. But also the intergenerational trauma, right? She experienced real trauma that forced her to cultivate the growing environment that my siblings and I had. So it gives me grace towards her. It gives me patience. And there are a lot of people in our lives that deserve that grace and patience. So this is why we should understand intergenerational trauma and its effects on the people who raised us and formed our environments. Also, I 100% believe and I'm confident that understanding intergenerational trauma may be the impetus for your own wellness. What do I mean? I love using words like impetus. That's just a way of saying the push you need to explore and to dig deep in your own wellness. Knowing that generations after you and around you are affected by your wellness can be the strength you need to seek your own wellness and break cycles. Breaking cycles is not a burden. It really is a privilege. It is something that you carry, but carry it as a crown. Carry it as an award, something that you have the privilege of exploring when others before you couldn't explore. What do I mean by the impetus you need for wellness? So when I was, again, diagnosed, I was told that I will always have anxiety, I will always have depression, and there's nothing you can do to be well. You can take medications that will numb it, but you can never be cured from it. And something in my spirit knew that wasn't quite right. As a Christian, I am called to be free and I am called to a life of total wellness. It doesn't mean that you're not going to struggle, but it does mean that healing for me is always possible because we believe that the God of the universe lives in us. So, how can I not have access to healing? And it wasn't until I went to my church some years ago and I was told, Joyce, you have to move differently. My pastor told me this. And he specifically said, the calling on your life is precious. And there are people who are waiting for your wellness because your wellness is tied to the wellness of other people. There are people who are waiting for your story because your story is tied to other people. And there are people who are waiting to see how you navigated to where you are today. Because in sharing how you got there, you are setting other people free. And it compounds and it compounds and it compounds. And it's a chain reaction. Let this not overwhelm you, rather, let it inspire you. Your wellness, your mental well being is tied to others. Even if you don't give children or have offspring of your own, there are people around you in your community who are looking to you. They may not be saying it, but they are looking to you to be well. And if you can't get well for yourself, at least try and get well for those you love and those around you. This was a big push for me. There are so many times on this journey where I was just overwhelmed. But then I would think about my baby brother and how he looks out to me and how he calls me about new sneakers and how we talk about new music. And I thought, I need to get well because he needs to see me well. I was always told that in my family, we're serious, we're prone to, we called it seriousness. But what I'm learning is that there is a pattern of depression in my family. A lot of us are undiagnosed, but when I watch the isolation, when I watch how they express themselves, again, in the Black community, we're not going to call it depression. We're going to call it, oh, she's just quiet, or oh, she likes to keep to herself, or she just likes to sleep. But really, what I'm seeing in my family is a pattern of depression. And I 100% believe that I am one of the people in my family who are called to break that cycle of depression, call light into darkness, and to change the narrative. And this is why I say don't see it as a burden, but a privilege. How powerful and how beautiful it is that you came across this show when you could have been doing anything else. You didn't come across it by chance. You very well may be the one in your family to break the narrative that has existed from generation to generation. You have the ability in you to write a new narrative. And it starts with you saying, I've seen this pattern of unwellness or illness in my family. It doesn't sound like how God has designed us to be. It doesn't sound like wellness. We have every right to wellness. I choose to break it. That is how simple it is. It starts with a decision in your mind that you are going to break the narrative that has plagued your family from generations. You do not always have to live in poverty. You do not always have to live in sadness. You do not have to be victims of slavery. You do not have to be victims of darkness. Does it mean that we act like our forefathers and our parents didn't go through difficult things? Of course not. But what it does mean is that we do not stay there. We find the resources like this room, this space, where we get tools to empower and equip ourselves. And we start to speak differently about what we want future generations to be like. Remember, we call it cultivate your mental wealth and your mental health for a reason. You have the ability to cultivate it. You have the ability to shift the narrative. You can learn different responses to the issues you face. Okay, friends. I know that was a lot of information and I hope that you're able to receive it. But this is one of the other favorite parts of my show that I love is when I do the audience check-in. So I would love to check in with you. This is why we're here. Again, you can share your story and all of your questions surrounding mental illness at comethrive247 at gmail.com. That is comethrive247 at gmail.com. If you share your story, one person from our team, most likely me, will respond to your questions. I will read and honor your stories. And we will even have a listeners episode where you can be featured at your permission, if you so desire, at a future date. Come thrive 24/7 at gmail.com. Let's get into some of the questions. Rondia, Miss Thomas, I'm so glad that you feel liberated by this. Janelle, yes, this is exact type of message, beautiful and powerful. This is what liberated me. This isn't mumbo jumbo. I'm living proof. I'm testimony. I was once too sick to even get out of bed. What I am saying works. It works. Now, Suraj, you asked, what is trauma? And I gave examples. Trauma could be childhood abuse. It could be genocide. We know a lot about genocide in Nigeria. It could be political unrest in your country. It could be poverty. It could be famine. It could be sexual or physical or verbal abuse. We can go into more about what trauma looks like at a later episode. I think that would be a great topic. But those are some general slavery for Black Americans is an example of trauma. Anything that impacts your safety and your basic needs and your rights as a human being, that could be considered trauma. And I'm happy to do an episode about that. Lauraville, how does this apply to someone who is adopted? I love this question because epigenetics talks about how what happens before you were born and how that affects how your genes are expressed. And while this is still a scientific theory, there is proof that your environment can affect how your mind processes things, how it affects your identity, and how it affects your mental health. So even if you were adopted as a child into a family, the environment that they cultivate still can impact your mental health, even if there is no blood relation. And this is why I talk about offspring, not just being the offspring that you birth, but the youth and the people around you who are observing you, who are hearing your words, who are watching how you express yourself. Your offspring doesn't necessarily have to be tied to your blood. But also, if we're going back to epigenetics, technically, what this theory proposes is that even if you are adopted into a different family, what your parents, your biological parents experience related to trauma, it could express and affect how your genes biologically are expressed. Now, it goes back to nature versus nurture and which one is stronger. The most important thing, as I've said, to remember is that all of this could be reversible. You do not have to be who your parents have been. You do not have to be chained and bound to that trauma. So, although it could affect the expression of your genes, you are not bound to a single narrative. You write your narrative, you change the story. If there are other questions, I hope that you are able to visit our email account and send them to me. I promise to read them. And if you want to share a story, I promise to read them too. And I thank you in advance for that. I have loved our discussion and I want to talk about what's coming up next. Tune in April 11th, same time, same day, Tuesday, as we talk about food and foods that affect your mood. This might be a series where we talk about veggies, processed food, eating out, sodium. How does what you eat affect your mind? Stay tuned on April 11th and you'll see. So I love talking to y'all. Thank you for the thoughtful questions. Ruby, thank you for joining from Tuscaloosa, Alabama. But now we're going to move into the part of the show that I also love, where I give you practical pushes towards mental wellness. Stay tuned. So the last time you were with me, we talked about journal prompts and how we can guide our reflection so that we can understand what's happening with us. If you want those journal prompts, please tune in to the last episode. It is on the BDO website. There are other ways to access that episode on YouTube, so definitely check it out. But here, the practical push that I have for you is talk to your family about their experiences, their hardships, their coping mechanisms. It is so important to hear and to learn about where our family comes from. If you don't know where you're from, you don't know where you're going. Talk to your parents about what they went through. Talk to your grandparents, your aunts, your uncles, your great aunts, your great uncles. I so believe that in hearing those stories, it allows you to give grace and may even forgiveness for the way you were raised. It also gives you context into this may be why I'm not affectionate, or this may be why I'm prone to stress. Hear their stories. What are some repeating patterns that you see? In my family, I'm seeing repeating patterns of depression. There's also addiction in my family. A lot of high achievers, more degrees than I'll ever have in my life, but a lot of coping with alcoholism and with those types of crutches. And by hearing those stories, I was able to identify patterns in my family that I believe God has called me to break. So listen, hear your stories. And my hopes are, as you're hearing stories and seeing patterns of illness, that it'll give you hope and a plan for how to seek wellness, not just for yourself, but for others. Okay. That is my practical push for you. Listen to your parents, call your mama if she's available. Hear those stories so that you can navigate from illness to wellness for yourself and for those you love. Again, I've loved having you in this space. Thank you for joining the room. I look forward to your questions at our email account, and I look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks. Go thrive. Take good care.